Good afternoon and good morning to everyone that's joined us today. So I'm in sunny Dubai, a little bit later now, starting to get into the evening. So I hope there's some people actually from the symposium that we just ran. So I'm just going to be checking on to see if they did actually turn into today's session. But obviously we're talking about the UK budget. So that's caused a bit of a stir last week. I think we sort of knew there was going to be some changes, but obviously welcome Joe and Lee. Is there a little bit more change than you expected?
Yeah, I mean, from my point of view, at a high level, I think it was a big surprise that so much of the tax hikes landed on employers' shoulders and the extent of that. And also, I think it was a surprise because, the government or the Labour Party had committed really not to raising tax for individuals, but there's plenty of research out there which actually shows that employer NIC rises ultimately will end up, at least in large part, with employees. So yeah, I was very surprised by that.
Oh, can somebody just saying they can't hear anything? Can anybody confirm if they can hear us now? If anybody's on. But anyway, Joe, what's your thoughts?
To be fair, from our point of view, the UK payroll, I think about the thresholds, I think about the calculation. So we knew they weren't going to change those from an employee point of view, and that's what we'll cover up, of course, in today's session. But as Lee said, there was an expectation they were going to go after the employer, and it certainly is what they've done. As you said, it's difficult to judge. It will be dependent on the number of employees you have within your company, whether you can continue to claim or even now can claim the employment allowance. That might offset some of the liability, but those big companies, they're paying. Yeah, they are definitely paying from the new tax year.
Yeah. So, okay. So I'll, who's starting off? Is it Lee? It will be yourself, is it?
Yeah, I think the plan is I'm going to cover a short piece on global mobility because for the first time in a long time, we've got some major changes in the area of global mobility in the budget. So we're going to have a quick look at that and also some implications for payroll. And then Joe's going to cover the main bulk of changes that are going to affect employers and payroll from a UK domestic perspective. So without further ado, I'll head on to the first slide. Thanks, Joe. Are you able to? Oh, there we go. So for those of you aren't aware, you may have heard of the non-domicile regime. It's been around for a long, long time. And that's the regime which, in essence, allows people who are non-domiciled in the UK to legally avoid paying UK income tax on income which is arising outside of the UK. That's the principle of it. So that non-domicile status, it enabled employees to claim relief on their overseas work days for the first 3 tax years that they were resident in the UK. So that non-domicile regime is being abolished for tax from 6 April 2025. But there is going to be, fortunately, a replacement with regards to overseas work days relief. So this will be of interest to employers who, for example, are recruiting people from overseas for the first time who are coming into the UK, because it's potentially going to mean an increased net income for those people. Or where you've got traditional secondments into the UK from an overseas parent company, for example. Now, I've put the various points there, but in essence, with the new regime, the concept of domicile is gone. So what it's been replaced with is a regime where you'll qualify for overseas work days relief where you have been non-resident in the UK for 10 consecutive years before you arrive in the UK. So that applies to UK nationals who've been out a long time, maybe lived and worked overseas for a long time, over 10 tax years, as well as those foreign nationals who are coming to the UK for the first time. Now, overseas work days itself, what it allows employees to do is essentially claim tax relief in respect of the days that they work outside of the UK. Whereas most of us who are living and working and resident in the UK, we're taxed. It doesn't matter if we go and work in France for a couple of weeks or America for a couple of months. If we remain resident in the UK, we're going to continue to be taxable here. Whereas under this overseas work days regime, regime, which is coming in from 6 April of next year, for the first 4 tax years of residence, people will be able to claim relief in respect of overseas work days. So as compared to the old relief, it's slightly more generous in that it applies for 4 tax years to align with a broader change to the non-domicile regime and the introduction of a new regime called the foreign income and gains regime. So it's slightly more generous on that front, but it's slightly less generous in this, or it's potentially a lot less generous in the sense that it is capped. So the relief is capped at the lower of £300,000 per year, or 30% of the individual's total income. So high earners in particular won't be able to get, the substantial relief that they have been able to claim in the past, because it will be capped. Unlike the current overseas work days regime, the new regime will essentially allow you to bring your foreign income, i.e. the income related to your overseas work days, into the UK. So there's none of these complex, or at least convoluted arrangements for qualifying bank accounts and so on. Those will no longer be required. Now, the relief itself is an individual's relief. It's claimed via their tax return. An individual every year needs to make an election in order that income earned during that year qualifies for overseas work days relief. In terms of how the relief is calculated, or in terms of the overseas work days, that will still be done on what's known as a just and reasonable basis, in terms of calculating the number of days that are worked overseas compared to the number of days that are worked in the UK. And another small change, but could have a big impact in some areas, is that expenses related to the overseas work days, it could be foreign accommodation under temporary workplace relief, for example, that will be deductible before the overseas work days relief is applied, whereas under the current regime, where you've got tax relievable expenses which relate to overseas work days, those aren't, you can't deduct them in effect. So whilst that is an individual tax relief applying to employees, it'll be of interest to employers just generally, because it could also form part of negotiation of package, because somebody's going to potentially have a bigger net income, for example, where they're working outside of the UK during the first 4 years of their residence in the UK. But also there are some impact as well for employers. If you can just turn over the slide, Joe. Where an individual is eligible for overseas work days relief, then it is possible, they can either claim that relief via their tax return at the end of the tax year, and they can also, which can really help from a cash flow perspective, with the agreement of their employer, the employer can apply to essentially have pay-as-you-earn prorated on an estimated basis. What does that mean? It means essentially you're estimating the number of overseas work days, and then you're taking that out of the pay-as-you-earn calculation and just operating pay-as-you-earn in respect of the UK duties. It doesn't apply to NIC, by the way, overseas work days relief. It's just tax and pay-as-you-earn. You don't prorate the NIC where it's due. So there's been a change in that process as well. For those of you who are familiar with global mobility, you'll be as frustrated as I in many cases where you apply for this proration direction, or Section 690 direction as it's more formally known, from HMRC. And it can take months and months sometimes to come through. And all that time the individual is waiting, and full pay-as-you-earn has been operated on their income. Where under the new regime introduced next year from 6 April, what it will allow employers to do is essentially notify HMRC that they're going to operate pay-as-you-earn on an estimated basis, because overseas work days relief is likely to be due. And then once they get an automatic response, which I assume will be immediate from HMRC, then they can operate that Section 690 direction. So it's kind of turning the process around a little bit to make it hopefully more quicker. So I do think that is a positive change. I only wish and hope that they do that also for no tax codes as well. So that's the change for employers. Important to note, however, that, HMRC will still review those directions at some point and have the right to adjust the proportions of income that's subject to pay as you earn. And also, I would guess, deny the relief as well, where they don't think it's due or has been made on an erroneous basis. So that's the pay as you earn direction. If you just turn over leaf. So some other sort of side measures related to the new regime. Under the current regime, where somebody's non-domiciled, the employer is entitled to pay on a tax-free basis or reimburse on a tax-free basis or pay directly expenses on a tax-free basis where those relate to travel to and from the non-domiciled individual's home country. And that relief lasts for 5 tax years in most cases. Under the new regime from next year, employers will still be able to do that where people qualify under this new regime, i.e. being non-resident for 10 consecutive tax years before they arrive in the UK and become resident. But the relief will now be limited to 4 years rather than 5 years. So employers will want to reflect that in their policies and also how they deal with that via their benefits and expense reporting process. And just a brief bit, under the current regime, it is possible to claim overseas work days relief with regards to share option income, share incentive income, RSUs, any securities income, as it were. So that will still apply. There have been some tweaks in terms of the terminology, but that in principle will still apply under the new regime introduced next year. So overall, I think whilst it's bad news for non-domiciled individuals generally, I think for employees, actually, it's good news that the overseas work days relief is not going to be abolished altogether, tempered by the fact that there is going to be a cap on the relief going forward. So it will be less financially advantageous. So that's all I wanted to cover. I'm now going to hand over to Joe.
Thank you, Lee. Thanks very much indeed. Okay, guys, we're going to move more on to, of course, the usual UK payroll update changes and what's come through on the budget itself. So just as I said, as Mel introduced us right at the beginning, we weren't really expecting any changes, were we, as far as some of these thresholds and percentages were concerned? And that's happened, and that's because ultimately these, the tax, the percentages, the thresholds, they were frozen. So we were expecting these to change until April 2028, and that's what the Chancellor's confirmed. So it's at that point where we will hopefully start to see an increase on things like the personal allowance, because it's remaining frozen, guys. It remains at £12,570. That also means, of course, as far as our percentages are concerned for the tax, etc., all remains the same. For the rest of the UK, that's technically Northern Ireland, England and Wales, our threshold remain the same. So your basic rate threshold is £37,700, and of course that additional rate increased the other year, of course, up to £125,140. So what's the knock-on effect to this? That's the question, isn't it? Because we know the frozen, so our calculations, we know exactly what we're going to be dealing with from April 2025. But let's take a look at some of the stats and figures, because these have been frozen since tax year 21-22. We are very quickly approaching 25-26, and there's no changes on these technically for the rest of the UK and Wales, if we throw those in as well. HMRC have released their stats. They have said since 2021, we now have an extra 4.4 million people paying tax. That's because the personal allowance has not changed. So they're being pushed above that bracket. Various reasons. It could be the minimum wage. It could be, of course, becoming maybe a bit more full-time rather than part-time. But there's 4.4 million extra people now paying, sadly, 20% tax. The next bracket above is 40% tax. We've got 1.9 million extra people paying 40% tax. So it's happening quite naturally. This is what we said back in 2021. If they freeze these thresholds, that's all they have to do. We will naturally start to move into those next brackets and naturally start to pay more tax back. Expectation or estimates really from HMRC, if we continue down this path, which of course Chancellor's confirmed that will happen until 2028, we're looking at an extra 2.7 million people becoming 40% taxpayers. So that's extra on top of what we have now. So that's what's going to happen. We're going to continue down that path. So as Lee mentioned at the beginning, eventually, as employees will start to feel that pinch, we will start to feel that pain, unfortunately. As far as the 45% taxpayers are concerned, we did get some stats on those. You have an extra 600,000 people now paying 45% tax since this freeze came on board. So look out for it. We know, of course, as far as England is concerned and Northern Ireland, we know what we've got in play. The next thing is to wait for Scotland and Wales. So Wales, to confirm the percentages that they're going to apply from the new tax year, they have the ability to change those. For Scotland, it's carte blanche, you know, they can change anything. We had the new advanced rate introduced last year, or this tax year, I should say. So let's just see what they have to do. Look out for that over the next couple of months. Hopefully, we'll get those confirmed. Where are we from a national insurance point of view? Well, just as we kind of predicted, they haven't changed anything. We had this decrease, didn't we, on the primary contribution. It's gone down to 8%. So if you remember, well, this time last year, really, it was 12%, wasn't it? They brought it down to 10%, and then in January they brought it down further to 8%. They've honoured that. They've kept it. So as employees, as the voters, our net pay, and this is their strapline, our net pay remains the same. So in theory, of course, March compared to April, we're receiving hopefully the same amount of net pay. For somebody on an ANI category letter, that's probably the bulk of us. No change. The primary threshold remains the same, aligned with the personal allowance, and of course it's the same with the upper earnings limit remaining at that £50,270. So no change for the primary, kind of good news. However, as Lee said, it's the secondary, it's the employer who's taken the hit, and it's the national insurance where they focus. 2 hits we've had. So moving into April 2025, the secondary threshold is to be reduced. So it's at this point where the employer starts to pay national insurance. This is an annual figure I'm showing you here on the screen. Currently, it's sat at £9,100, so that's going to be brought down. So that means the employer will start to pay national insurance sooner, basically, the more the payers. And of course, it's the increase, pushing it up from that 13.8% into 15% for the employer's national insurance. So across the board there, you can see this increase and the knock-on effect to businesses. But we do have this, okay, so I just wanted to bring this into play. This is something called the employment allowance. It's been around for 10 years now. It was introduced back in 2014. And at the time, it was only £2,000. But technically, all employers could kind of claim this £2,000. And it's used to offset the employer's national insurance contributions. So £2,000, you know, maybe not a huge amount. But of course, nowadays, it's slightly more. So today's figure here now today, and the employment allowance is £5,000 for this current tax year, 24-25. The issue we have is that since 2020, this has been restricted to what's kind of claimed as small employers. So a small employer under the employment allowance simply means that for the previous tax year, the employer's NI liability was less than £100,000. So if yours was less, you could claim the employment allowance, again, currently sat at £5,000. But if you were more than that, so seen as a large business, you couldn't claim anything. So you had to pay out basically the employer's national insurance. But this is a change to it. So they've increased the employment allowance, double plus, of course, it's £10,500 as we move into that new tax year. They've also removed the small employer restriction. So it means we go back to a point of where we can all kind of claim this employment allowance. I do apologise for the size of the font here. I was trying to get everything on this. What I'm trying to say to you is, hopefully, fingers crossed, as employers, yet again, we can claim the employment allowance back. The way it's done at the moment, I can't see that changing. It's through the EPS. So in April, you tick the relevant box within your EPS to say you're going to claim the employment allowance for this PAYE reference, and the software, and of course HMRC, will then start to adjust. So for the first £10,500 of employer NI liability, it's removed, and the employer will pay anything above that ultimately. So again, you should see it on your remittance reports, your P30s, P32s to HMRC. The list you're seeing on the screen is the key list, because these are the businesses who cannot claim the employment allowance. They are the ones who were hit by these change, really. And of course, as we said to Mel earlier, the bigger businesses who were way above the £10,500. But look out for some of these ones. Single director payrolls, if you're running a payroll bureau, Maybe you're running those for those directors. They're going to be, I've got an example of this as I go through. You've also got businesses who have multiple PAYE references. They're referred to as connected companies. It's one company that gets it, one PAYE. You don't get it for everyone. So remind yourself of these rules. It's been a few years since you've claimed it. Remind yourself of the rules. Make sure you can claim it moving forward from April. I've got an example on here just talking about these single directors and this comparison to March versus, of course, what's going to happen in April. So I've kind of said, which lots of, the payroll administrators, accountants, etc., will be doing this. They're simply taking the current secondary threshold per month. So I'm saying in March, we're paying this director, single director payroll, nobody else is on it. We're paying them £758 per month. So there's no primary threshold, there's no primary contribution, there's no secondary contribution, but there's enough because we're above the LEL to claim out what state pension, isn't it? It's our statutory payments we have an entitlement to. So lots of us run the single director payrolls this way. And technically, of course, there's no actual payment due to HMRC. But come April, that's a different story, because in April, unfortunately, the secondary threshold is below the LEL. Again, I've rounded down, but with my calculations, I think I've got it around £416. But again, check on the figures when they come out. But even using these kind of rough figures, if you go with the same stance of let's get it at or above the LEL, so the £533 per month, that means the employer contribution would be £17.55. We spread that over the 12 months. Of course, you're looking at over £200. It's now going to cost those directors and employers national insurance because they can't claim the employment allowance. So there's several things to bear in mind. I did compare this to the voluntary, the class 3 national insurance, and I thought, is that a better option? That's coming in at £17.75 from April. So your PAYE might be the better or the cheaper option, but compare your figures, wait till those thresholds are absolutely confirmed and just run through your calcs, okay? Another one, just another example, how much is it going to cost the business? Again, comparing somebody who's got a £3,000 salary, the employer NI in March is coming out at £309.40. But in April, because of that lower secondary threshold, because of the 15%, of course, national insurance, it's now coming up at £78.20 more for the same salary. However, remember what we said, the employment allowance. Maybe that business couldn't claim the employment allowance in that tax year 24-25, but they might be able to claim it in 25-26, in which case we can offset that £387.60 against the £10,500. But the more employees you have, of course, the higher that bill becomes, and that employment allowance becomes, to a certain extent, maybe a bit of a drop in the ocean. But claim it, guys. That's the bottom line. You've not been doing it for a few years. Look at the rules and see if you can get that claimed in April for the business. You're going to offset and save them at least 10 grand there. Because, of course, it doesn't stop there, does it? The pressure on the business is applied again because we look at national minimum wage. And, of course, it's the Low Pay Commission who had their remit changed this year to include the cost of living. So they've pushed it all the way up. Even the kind of middle predictions were coming in around £12.10, but it went even higher, of course, coming in at £12.21 per hour from April next year. That, again, it's my math, so apologies on the decimal points, but I'm coming up with roughly about 6.7% increase there based on the current national minimum wage. That's now, of course, available for those that are 21 and above. So this is the other thing, this banding underneath, this 18 to 20-year-olds, that's a higher percentage. Again, my maths roughly around 16.2%. The reason it's a higher percentage is because ultimately minimum wage is age discrimination. It is, isn't it? You could all be doing the same job, but potentially somebody could be paid a lower value than you, a lower hourly rate, because of these minimums that have been put in place. So this current government want rid of it. So I'm predicting now over the next couple of years they'll aim to do that. So you may see a slightly higher increase on that lower band over the next few years. But look out for it because it's going up to £10 per hour. So those that are 18 and above, it's going to cost the business more money. We've then got, of course, the under 18s, the apprentices, also receiving a 9.3% increase, pushing them up to £7. So what does all of this mean? Well, number one, if you are over 21, and above. If you're working 40 hours per week full time, your salary is going up to over £25,500. It's over that amount to get the minimum. So huge salary increases for businesses to really consider. It potentially means some of us where we are salaried, maybe you're thinking, but I earn £25,000 a year. Are you suddenly now at minimum wage? So my advice to you, if you work in payroll, if you're working in finance, do your reports now, do your checks now, and please, please include the salary sacrifice within that calculation. If you've got salary sacrifice, pension, childcare vouchers, cycle to work, electric vehicles, there's all sorts of schemes out there. Whatever you're running, include them in the calculation, because they are reducing the employee's salary. And if it takes them below £12.21 come April, you're in breach. So do it now, do the calculations now, spread the word, chat to the HR teams, chat to the finance director, controller, whoever you need to speak to, because you might be needing extra funding come April. You might need to take people out of those schemes. So think about how you're going to go around doing this. Really try and put some effort in upfront if you can. You've got a couple of months to go, guys. Let me move on quickly though, because of course I've got some examples on the calculation and how this is going to come together. So based on those figures, it means in March, the employer cost, of course, somebody working 40 hours a week, they're receiving or should be receiving at least £457.60 in their packet per week. That means from the employer's point of view, on the current secondary threshold and the 13.8%, we're coming in at £36.74. Pension, don't forget the pension, of course, 3% minimum, £10.13. Compare that now to just a month later. I'm saying a month later, I've done a weekly figure here, haven't I? But after a month later, somebody working 40 hours a week again. So a weekly pay of £488.40. The employer's national insurance push way up there to £58.86. And of course, the pension increasing as well. But remember what we said, if you can claim the employment allowance, offset the first £10,500, but the bigger the company, the more this is going to cost the business. Couple of things to bear in mind, just as Lee mentioned earlier on, although we might as employees not feel the pinch in April, our net pay may remain the same, eventually over time it will start to impact us, because these businesses are now paying out potentially a couple of million on top of what they've been paying already. So they either allow that to eat into their profit, or they pass it on to the consumer, or they don't give you a salary increase moving forward. So they start to maybe pull back some of the benefits you're receiving, maybe some of the salary, as in not doing increases moving forward. So eventually, this is what the research is saying. It might not hit us now, but eventually down the line it could do. So several things to bear in mind. I've put a note on here about the apprenticeship levy. That's not gone away. It's still there. It's based on NIable pay. So as the NIable pay is increased in April based on this minimum wage, your apprenticeship levy is increasing as well. It's costing the employer. Now, we do know we are expecting changes on this. They're saying to us that the new growth and skills levy will be introduced at some point, and that's going to replace the current existing apprenticeship levy. They're also changing and making it a bit more flexible as far as apprentices are concerned. So dig into that a bit more if you are interested. I'm running out of time, I do apologise, but let me move on to what we know about benefits, because of course we've got some of the figures now coming in, some of these based on the consumer price index percentage. Number one, you might, if you're dealing with this, is these double cab pickup trucks. They've been an issue for a few years. You may remember back in February this year, I think it was February, and for about 7 days, HMRC told us that double cab pickup trucks from the 1st of July will be cars. And then they removed the information and said, oh no, we've changed our mind, they can remain as vans. Anyway, this government is now pushing that forward. It's not based on a case that has just concluded, where there's always been this issue of, is the double cab pickup truck transporting goods or is it transporting people? So basically what they're saying to us is from the 1st of April 2025, any new contracts, any new leases for those double cab pickup trucks, the calculation for the benefit in kind is a car. It will be classed as a car. Okay, so if you've got one now, you're okay. If you've agreed a lease to come out and you've done it now, but you're not getting until after April, you're still safe. You can run it as a van or process it as a van. But dig into that if you do offer double cab pickup trucks within your employ. Next one, as far as company vans are concerned, we've got an increase on that going up to £4,020 for the year. If you provide the fuel, that's confirmed at £769. I can't see anything on zero emission vans. That's been 0% for the last couple of years, and I've not seen anything following on from this budget. So I'm assuming, I'm going to dig into it further, but that potentially those electric vans remain the same as a 0% tax-free benefit to a certain extent, isn't it? What we're talking about as far as the CO2 emissions is concerned, this was confirmed under the old government in November 2022, I think it was. They confirmed that from tax year 25 onwards, those percentages would increase by 1 point. So we talk about these electric and hybrid vehicles. So we know they're going to start to increase. Okay, they've been frozen for a couple of years. This government has confirmed from 2028 that they are going to increase the points, but they're also increasing the highest percentage. That at the moment and for the next few years is 37%, but come 2028, it's going to push up to 38%. Okay, so just look out for it. It's all a cost to the businesses and well, the employee as well as far as the taxation is concerned. Vehicle excess duty, another double whammy here. They're paying double the equivalent rates for 2024 to 2025. This is for not the electric vehicles. It's for not technically a green car. So it's above the 76 CO2 emission. Look out for it. It's affecting all of us, isn't it? Certainly if we have a car that's not electric. The other thing that they are going to look into as a review is these electric vehicles are very expensive, of course, and the expensive car supplement starts to kick in. That's an extra, I call it road tax, but vehicle excess duty in theory that you're paying. In the future, they're saying they're going to review that threshold. It's currently sat at £40,000. So for electric vehicles, they will probably increase it. That will encourage us as consumers to continue to buy them, of course. We've also had confirmed that the company car fuel fixed multiplier has increased to £28,200. That's been frozen along with the van for the last couple of years. So we've got that increase coming on board. The other one, if you do offer these, if you've got, maybe fleets of cars, and certainly if you've got employees who drive a lot of business miles, you may have gone down the path of these car ownership schemes. They're getting rid of them. They want rid of them. So look into that if you are affected, if you offer those out to your employees. And finally, I move on to this one. It's the SSP consultation. Some changes. I keep saying this about SSP, of course. It's something the employer simply has to pay out, isn't it? We can't recover the money back. But interestingly, they do want to make changes to it. So the current system at the moment, the way it works is, of course, with today's figures, we receive £116.75 per week. It's providing that our average weekly earnings that were above the LEL, that 123. So that's our eligibility to receive. It means that we have to have 4 or more consecutive days off in a row. That's referred to as a PIW, a period of incapacity for work. And then we have this concept of qualifying days. So the days we work, and that's where the SSP is payable. But the first 3 qualifying days are referred to as waiting days. So we don't get any SSP ultimately. So there is a consultation now taking place. What they're talking about doing is removing the average weekly earnings test. So in theory, everybody would be entitled to SSP because there's no length of service. It's simply based on our earnings. So removing that test, they're talking about removing the 3 waiting days. So again, what I've read, it looks like the PIW would have to remain 4 or more consecutive days, but SSP is paid from the first day, a little bit like we had during lockdown, during COVID. The next thing they are consulting on is having a lower of the 2. So we still go through an average weekly earnings calculation, and then we take a percentage of that. So you receive the lower of the 2. So that's what the consultation is working on at the moment. So it could be a while before this comes into play, but very much suspecting that the new Fair Work Agency will be responsible for this. So our expectation is that it sounds like it does have a similar feel to the single enforcement body, which was started up but never took off, unfortunately, a few years back. So it looks like it's in the same kind of remit. It's going to pick up things like our rights to receive as employees, as workers, our rights to SSP, our rights to national minimum wage, our rights to holiday pay and leave. So it's that team, that agency who will be responsible for ensuring we're doing the right thing, of course, as employers. So there's lots coming up in the future, guys. It's not just 2025, it's beyond there as well. I do apologise, Mel. I think I'm about 4 minutes over. I do apologise.
No worries. I think we needed to do maybe a longer session because there's just so much going on, isn't there? And I think like like all the politicians, they always sort of let out the rumours, don't they? And I think they've sort of said over the weekend this is the beginning of tax changes. So maybe we're going to be having a few more of these.
Yeah, it's very true. It's very true. And again, I mean, this session, I'm just trying to cover the highlights really, but you're absolutely right. You could really drill down into some of these areas, and it's going to continue, Mel. You're absolutely right. The slogan, make work pay, is certainly doing that. It's certainly living up to the name.
I don't want to be controversial, but I think it's make employers pay, isn't it? And anyway, I know we can't get controversial and political, so I will be quiet. Lee, is there anything that you'd like to add before we leave?
No, just very briefly, there is a consultation out with regards to permanent establishments, and also there have been some changes to the employee benefit trust rules as well, just for employees to flag it with them if they've got employee benefit trusts, that they'll need to look at that. And that's it really from me.
So just a super quick question. Is this worse than Liz Truss? Or is it totally different? Shall I ask? Completely different. Oh well, okay. I won't get political, but thank you to everyone that has joined us. Thank you, Joe and Lee. Great as always, and thank you. I know obviously there's so much information, but thank you for providing the high level. And we'll end up seeing you at the beginning of December. Obviously, we've got the states going on today, so we've got another little change going on. So let's see what happens. But thank you, everyone, and we'll see you all again soon.
Thanks, Mel.
Thanks, Mel. Thank you, everyone.